All right, so we are live. So I'll be chatting with Neil Sinhababu about new paper yet to be published, which presents two naturalistic arguments for hedonism. Um, so yeah, we'll be discussing those. So do you want to just start by laying out the reliability argument for hedonism?
Oh, yeah, okay. So both of these arguments are little three-premise arguments, and you can... should I post the link to the Phil papers where they are?
Yeah, you can post the link. I think I have it. I think I put the link to it in the chat, so I think people should.
Okay, good. You already have it. All right, great. Yeah. So anyone who wants to follow along the action can do so with the link. So the first argument is the reliability argument. So this is an argument about the reliability of the processes that generate our moral beliefs, and it owes a lot to reliabilist epistemology. Reliabilists hold that the reliability of a process is the likelihood that the beliefs it generates are true. So sort of if you picked a random belief generated by the process, how likely it is that it's true. What I argue here is that we have a reliable process that tells us that pleasure is good. And this is phenomenal introspection, the process by which we know what our experiences are like. So you can tell that your color experiences have varying levels of brightness, that your sound experiences have varying levels of volume. You can tell which color and sound experiences you're having at a moment. You can do this pretty well. You generally don't get it wrong about stuff like this. If you think that human beings are getting it wrong all the time about stuff like this, you have a picture of us as completely not getting our own inner lives. And why would we think that's the case? I'm just assuming that reliability of being able to know what your experiences are like. And I think you can know that pleasure is good and pain is bad in that way. That's something you can know by looking inward at what a pain is like. It's a bad feeling, whereas a pleasure is a good feeling. So that knowledge comes to us reliably. I am not confident in our knowledge of just about anything else about morality for a couple of reasons. The big one that pushed me to lose confidence in our ability to know the moral truth is arguments and disagreement. So it really strikes me how many people throughout history have thought that genocide was not only permissible, but the right thing to do or a heroic thing to do. And this goes back into our most ancient holy texts. The Bible has, the Old Testament, the divine lawgiver, God, is commanding horrendous genocides where they are supposed to kill everything that breathes in some other cities. So if we have people thinking that they should do that, that it's morally right to do that, and just feeling like that's the thing to do, human moral judgment is subject to massive error and massive unreliability. Now, even if you take the genocide people's side, you get massive error, because then all us modern people who think that genocide is a horrible thing to do, we're wrong. So there's just no way with sufficiently large disagreement, like the kind of disagreement we see about the permissibility of genocide, to get people coming out right for our moral judgment processes to be reliable. So that's one kind of argument that has a lot of impact on me. You can do the genocide example, but there's a whole bunch of other issues, from sexual morality to how to punish crimes, to how resources should be distributed throughout society, to how to treat animals, all kinds of other things where you'll see similar disagreement. So the other kind of argument that has gotten a lot of attention recently in philosophy are these evolutionary debunking arguments. And what these arguments do is they look at the evolutionary history of the processes that generated moral belief. And what they say is, if you look at how these processes were formed, the forces shaping them give us moral beliefs that would help our survival and reproduction in the ancestral era, not necessarily truth. Now, there's some things for which what helps your survival and reproduction is the truth. For example, seeing what's around you is very useful, and knowing where food is and where predators are and where mates are and where your offspring are, all that's really useful. Knowing the truth about that, you can see how that promotes reproduction and survival. But if you're talking about things like knowing the moral truth, you might do better if you share the moral errors of your community than if you actually get the truth about things. So that's why we have to expect whatever evolutionary processes are driving us, they're not going to point us in the direction of the moral truth. So if we got the moral truth systematically from these processes that are evolutionarily generated, that would be pretty coincidental. And we shouldn't be betting, our knowledge of the moral truth on these coincidences. So what these arguments from disagreement and evolutionary debunking arguments show is there's good reasons to think that a lot of unreliability is in the processes generating our moral judgments. Not necessarily that every process generating them is unreliable, but we just can't expect a lot of reliability in these processes, a lot of a tendency to lead to truth. However, we have one thing that we know works, phenomenal introspection, and we can see that that works well from non-moral cases. So that's what we should trust. Trust the one that we know works from the non-moral evidence. It tells us pleasure is good and displeasure is bad. All the other stuff, I don't know why we should expect that to be reliable. So that's basically what the reliability argument is saying.
Okay, so one first question about the evolutionary debunking account. Well, so do you just want to lay out how you think the reliability argument resists potential debunking?
Yeah, good. So the strongest thing is just that we know phenomenal introspection works from other kinds of cases. If you want an independent check on phenomenal introspection, sensation of the outside world tends to match up pretty well with introspection of the inner world. So you have that kind of check. If you trust your sensations about the outside, well, they match up pretty well. So that's pretty good. Also, if you try to build up a story about how we know things where we're just constantly confused about, am I having any color sensations right now? Am I having any sound sensations right now? Oh, I might be mistaken. I just don't even know how you can build a plausible story about my psychology that, has me completely confused about that. So there's a bunch of reasons to trust this that on the non-moral stuff. That just that's the strongest evidence for supporting it. But it also withstands both the argument from disagreement and the evolution debunking arguments in its own ways. We don't see massive disagreement generated by introspection about what anyone believes at a time, partly because only one person can introspect, their own sensations at a time. So you're not going to get disagreement arising at all. On the evolutionary side, as you asked about, I think if you had a creature that just couldn't figure out what its own inner life was like, what sensations it was feeling, and so on, it might have serious problems dealing with the outside world. It just wouldn't know what was in front of it. Now, there's some views of perception that say, really, you know the outside world first, and somehow you infer the inside from it. And I can even work with those, even though I don't think that's the best way to go here. If you have it that way, even then, a complicated social being like ourselves, if you have a bunch of emotions, you'll need to talk with your fellow social beings about your feelings at some point. And if you're completely inarticulate about your feelings, if you can't even understand what you're feeling like and sort of understand yourself that way, well, you're going to have trouble dealing with others in society. So that's why I'd think that any being that was evolving for being able to have complicated social relations, if it couldn't tell how it was feeling, it's not doing well, and we should expect evolutionary considerations to support our knowing what our internal experiences are like.
Okay, so starting with the case of disagreement. So the fact that there's a significant disagreement does seem to show, I think, decisively that our methods for forming beliefs in a particular domain are not infallible. But I don't think that means that they're wholly unreliable. So take the example of politics. I think that there's a huge amount there's more political disagreement than there is moral disagreement. And yet I don't think that gives us reason to throw out all of our political beliefs that aren't formed through phenomenal introspection. And it seemed like the case that you gave of genocide. The reason you gave the case of genocide instead of the case of abortion is because genocide is something that we're really confident is bad. But it seems like the way that we're really confident that it's bad is by just reflecting on features about genocide. So it seems like if you're throwing out intuitions entirely, then you can be no more confident that genocide is bad than you are in utilitarianism. And it seems like we can maybe be more confident that genocide is bad than in the phenomenal introspection argument. So those were sort of 2 points.
Yeah. So on the genocide issue, the reason that I focus on that one, actually. I mean, it has some rhetorical effectiveness because we're so confident it's bad, I'll admit that. But the way I'd rather see it is, here's something that... So, I mean, our confidence is that it's bad plays a role in this, and also the severity of the badness that we think it has. So, suppose there's a lot of people who are confident it's bad and have a very high severity on it, or regard it as being very severely bad. And then there are other people who regard it as a good, heroic thing to do. Well, the degree of disagreement there is just really huge. So obviously, if you're running an argument for disagreement, you want really huge disagreements to power your argument. On the abortion issue, there's a reason I don't do that, which is now, I don't think there is really any case for fetal personhood in the first trimester or moral significance, but I can see how people get confused into that. You know, if you're looking at the fetus and thinking this is a baby, once you get down that path, okay, we all regard babies as, morally important to save in some way. So I can kind of see how I have something in common there with the anti-abortion people, though I think they're scientifically mistaken. Babies are worth saving is something we'd agree on. So, there I think there's sort of smaller, more subtle issues that are tripping us up. Where the genocide thing, I can't figure out sort of a something that makes the other side make sense that way.
Yeah. So, and what would you make of the other point that I raised, that if the only way, if intuitions aren't evidence because of disagreement, then we can be no more confident that genocide is bad than we are in hedonic act utilitarianism, because the only way that we know that genocide's bad is through hedonic act utilitarianism.
Oh, well, the thing you said at the end I like, but that's the way that I think our knowledge that genocide is bad finally, comes back in this. I mean, if you were just trying to get it off of what are my intuitions about it, once you see that, well, your fellow humans are just all over the place on this issue. Once you see that, it's sort of like, well, is the ocean made of salt water or milk or blood? Well, if all my fellow humans are coming to different conclusions than me on what the ocean is made of, what I'm going to think is there's some deep problem with human knowledge about what oceans are made of, and I've got to investigate what's going on over there. I'm not going to remain that confident in my own views. Similarly, if the situation with the age of the universe was as it was in, say, 1400, where you just go from culture to culture and people have all different ideas about how old the universe is, I would be like, okay, well, I don't know how old the universe is. I'm not sure. But so I think it sets up as a disagreement like that. But once you get hedonic utilitarianism back, you can see, okay, genocide is just full of suffering. And then you have the correct story about, knowing it's wrong.
Yeah. So, so what would you make of a story of how we form reliable moral beliefs of a type sort of like humor, where our so the fact that there's immense disagreement does seem to show that our beliefs are often wrong, and our intuitions are certainly often wrong as well. But it seems like if you just had the smartest defender of genocide debate the smartest opponent of genocide, where they appealed to plausible moral principles. The opponent of genocide said things like, well, those people are different from us, so we can kill them. So then, the rebuttal is like, well, why does difference make the people not morally salient, etc. I imagine that debate would be won by the opponent of genocide, and so it seems like even if it's true that our beliefs are not particularly reliable, it seems like when we carefully reflect, most reasonable people can come to beliefs, and it seems like if you look at what most of those beliefs are, those beliefs tend to be pretty reliable. So people who have really thought about the issue and considered the arguments on both sides, in an open-minded way, I think they're not going to be pro-genocide. And I actually think that this also gives a potential solution to evolutionary debunking arguments, because you'd expect us to evolve to be able to carefully reason and reliably form beliefs. So the same principle that allows us to form beliefs about calculus, even though that's not directly evolutionarily advantageous, could plausibly also allow us to form beliefs in the moral domain through careful reasoned reflection.
Yeah, well, I would like to think that you're right, but historically, I really worry about this. I mean, if you had that argument, I think you'd find a lot of people finding the glory of the Reich or the Tsar, sufficient reason to go ahead and commit the genocide. And people really feel this way strongly about their communities and what's important in the world. And, uh, you can dress it up with, all kinds of views about what individual meaning and significance and the importance of your community and all these things amount to. I really worry that what we're doing here is, we modern people have a certain set of sentiments that make the anti-genocide views look very natural to us, but starting with the sort of tendencies to find moral propositions plausible that you'd encounter in other cultures and other societies, just the premises that we're arguing from would seem strange to them, and their own premises would seem much more natural.
Sure. So, I mean, I think one illustrative example, rather than having to peer through history and make guesses at what most people would believe, I think one good example is modern factory farming. Factory farming is a relatively, most people consume meat from factory farms. And yet, if you look at most philosophers who have seriously discussed the issues, most of them agree that factory farming is really bad, even though that's not what's culturally dictated, and in particular, a lot of the intuitionist philosophers who don't try to reason from like implausible premises from natural law theory or some other crazy view like that. But I mean, Humor is a big opponent of factory farming. Singer, in arguing against factory farming, appeals to sort of plausible moral premises. And it seems like if we're comparing, I think that factory farming and genocide are relatively similar. I mean, factory farming I think is worse, but I think that they're structurally similar in that they both involve sort of an outgroup being brutally mistreated, and it seems like it would be easier to convince people of the badness of factory farming than of the badness of genocide. Or sorry, other way around. Easier to convince people of the badness of genocide than the badness of factory farming, because people have more in common with humans than with farm animals. And so all of this is to say that, well, I agree with you that we should not just defer very much to the average person's intuitions. I think that in an age where there's vast amounts of information availability, such that arguments like Aristotle's terrible argument for slavery that just had a series of obviously false premises, arguments like that wouldn't pass peer review these days. And so I think given that, I would be somewhat hesitant to just defer to what most people believe, but I'd be less hesitant to defer to the considered judgment of lots of philosophers, and particularly if we consider a variety of seemingly plausible principles that seem to converge on one thing, and we have a plausible debunking story to be told. I think that while not infallible, that is some evidence in the moral domain.
Yeah. Well, I like humor, and I like Peter Singer. I like all these people who I regard as good people to discuss issues with, who we can make progress with. I think I do have to insist on history here, though, because you're going to find a huge proportion of the human beings who have existed throughout history. And if we're trying to figure out how good are humans at seeing the moral truth, well, the population has to include the historical population. Then we're getting at what humans are like. I also think that the reason that you can get so much convergence between me, Humor, Singer, and a bunch of other contemporary folks partly has to do with very contingent historical conditions. So right now we're in this big global environment where we can interact with other human beings all around. And there is a real need for standards that we can all live by and do international trade according to. And if you can't live by standards that the rest of the world can, you end up sanctioned and unable to participate in the larger prosperity. So everyone kind of inclines, eventually towards doing that. Russia is playing badly right now, and so they're getting in some trouble. That's sort of the a way that the modern world has gone. And in that kind of environment, the kinds of things that people find intuitive are very different from when you were in the environment of, say, 1300 or 1000 BC. I think that if you took the philosophers of today to the 1000 BC people, they'd just be staring at us and being like, what are you even talking about? Those, animals, if you went to Kant, he'd say these animals aren't free. Why do we even care? So there's just, he had a really strange story about why we should care about them that involves, sort of almost like practice for, being good to people or something like that, which is, that can't be the story. So there's all kinds of different views out there. And I think once we take these really out there views seriously, because they're human views. This is just how our systems can be in a situation where we don't have a global economy. That really is what I think is giving us different views. And I can't really insist on the sort of, of course, the society with the global economy is the right one. How would I make that condition be the important one?
Okay, one potential objection is that it seems like you can make a similar objection to just philosophical reasoning as a whole. So if you just look throughout history, it seems like there have just been a huge number of false philosophical claims, such that probably most positions on philosophical issues throughout history have been wrong. And so given that, so what would you say about the sort of parity argument about why we should throw out our philosophical beliefs, which would include our belief in the argument from phenomenal introspection?
I don't regard philosophical reasoning as a well-unified process. And I don't think any reliabilist should. What you see there is, so there's some reliable processes in there. There's, if we're talking about sort of following sort of sound deductive or valid deductive arguments, that's going to be conditionally reliable on the premises. So you've at least got conditional reliability for valid deduction and a very strong conditional reliability. But where are the premises coming from? Well, if they're coming from, intuition of one kind or another, we've got to figure out how good that intuition is. And a lot of the premises people were building in weren't that good. That's, I think, one big source of error. Sometimes people are just using modes of argument that just aren't logically valid, and that's going to have its own problems. So there's just a lot of different processes coming in there into philosophical reasoning, and it's not, I think, cognitively well unified.
Okay. So one other potential argument for why we should trust moral intuitions is, so let's just imagine that the argument from phenomenal introspection, someone pointed out some devastating fatal flaw in it. So you concluded that argument was wrong. And the other argument, there was also some devastating fatal flaw, tragedy, your life's work destroyed. But but in its place, they design a magic 8-ball that you can only ask it one question, and it'll get the right answer 90% of the time. So it'll it'll get the right answer 90% of the time. So this is it's a decently reliable way of forming beliefs. And so you ask it, what is the correct reality? It'll self-destruct after you ask it the one question. And it says, maximize suffering and minimize happiness. Well, if our moral intuitions aren't evidence, and we've already thrown out the two non-intuitionist appeals to naturalistic evidence, then it would seem like you should think that there's roughly a 90% chance that we should maximize suffering. And yet, it seems like we should be more confident that we should not maximize suffering than more than 90% confident, even independently of these two arguments.
Yeah, well, I find it a little bit difficult to figure out what to say about this because you've already assumed the falsity of the big arguments I have, and now I'm just kind of like lost, and I don't really know what to say. Right. Well, what do I do about this 90% reliable device? What else do I have? Uh, um, do I have any other processes? I mean, you know what I'd probably do? I, uh, yeah, the sorts of considerations that show up in those arguments. Uh, you know, uh, okay, so if we are sort of having the devastation be so broad from whatever objections there are that I can't reconcile, sort of, well, or I can't bring back any considerations that allow me to reconstruct the arguments in any form at all. Yeah, I guess I could go with the 8 ball. I mean, I might stop caring about morality at that point. I might just be kind of like, uh, yeah, there's this thing, and there's a way in which we can go into what morality is about once we get to the universality argument. But if there's some kind of thing where we're thinking, okay, this is what right and wrong mean. This is what makes my feelings accurate about the world. This thing is the thing to hope for. That thing is the thing to be horrified by. Well, I keep trying to go back to the arguments here, and I try to figure out some way to rebuild them around whatever disaster you're finding, and I don't really know what to do if I can't do
that. Okay, well, so that's interesting. I mean, it seems like, I mean, I would just say that to just go back to the political analogy, I agree that there's a huge amount of error and political disagreement, but if there was a magic 8 ball that was 90%, and I didn't think we have a super reliable method for forming political beliefs. I mean, I think we can, reflect, but other similarly reflective people get the different answers. But if there was a magic 8 ball that informed us, that was right 90% of the time, and it informed us that that we should drop a nuclear weapon on Lebanon and then make it illegal to grow food or something, and just do all these crazy things. Even I think that even though our political beliefs are not totally reliable, I think that we can use them to at least rule out obviously crazy options. If every plausible political view converges that we should not randomly nuke Lebanon, or that we should not ban growing food, it seems like if they all converge, then that's better than 90% evidence. And I would say a similar thing about the moral domain, that certainly if all the moral views converge, then even if we're not, even if there's a decent chance that for any one of them, our belief forming mechanism is wrong, it's really unlikely that they're all wrong about an issue that's as fundamental as whether suffering is good or bad.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'd say that all views converge about that, because is suffering good or bad for? I mean, if those people suffer, is that good? Some people are, there's going to be views on which, the suffering of certain others is a positive good that one should strive for, and people get into moralizing certain hatreds where they come to think that really is a good.
But everybody disagrees with the claim that in general suffering is good.
Okay, yeah, that is generally disagreed with, yeah, and I think on the basis of phenomenal introspection.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is what I'm talking about here. If I lose the evidence of phenomenal introspection, then I don't even know why I'd think pleasure is good and displeasure is bad. I wouldn't even know what they are, So that's the way in which I can't really get anywhere if I lose those.
Yeah. I mean, just what I meant by losing phenomenal introspection wasn't that you lost the ability to phenomenally introspect. It was rather that you lost special reason to think that phenomenal introspection was especially reliable. So,
yeah. In that case, yeah. I mean, I don't know why I should think pleasure is good and displeasure is bad, because at that point, I've just kind of lost touch with it.
Okay. At one point, Do you have any thoughts on whether the phenomenal introspection or the reliability argument should hold weight for moral non-naturalists?
Yeah, let's see about this. So the place where I think the non-naturalist is going to object is to the premise that says we have no other reliable processes. Because the non-naturalist typically is an intuitionist who thinks intuition, which is different from phenomenal introspection, is a reliable process. Uh, yeah, and there I want their kind of story about what's going on with all the genocide people. Uh, why are these people intuiting wrong? Now, if they can tell some kind of story where they can clearly distinguish uh, reliable uses of intuition from unreliable uses, and they can show that, for example, here's what this could look like, and to some extent, Immanuel Kant tries to do this. He tries to give you an account of how we would intuit the moral truth that looks sort of like his account of how we know the mathematical truth. There's some very broad similarities to those things, and he can say we're doing the same general kind of thing. You can do this in other non-naturalist views as well. So if they can make those two line up and then say only some moral truths, and Kant kind of is doing this with his categorical imperative, which has, you can sort of see it as a reductio ad absurdum proof of the rightness of actions, where the wrong actions have a contradiction in them, in the way that, you prove things true by showing their negations to be contradictory and reductive ad absurdum proofs. If you can get something like that to dictate that specific actions are right, hey, good for you. Then you, as a non-naturalist, have what you need to deal with this. But non-naturalist views today are not articulated in that kind of way, where we can distinguish the reliable uses from the unreliable uses, all the way to getting a specific normative ethical theory. I don't think humor has that. I don't think Enoch has that. They just have, this looks intuitive to me and us, and I don't think that they're considering us broadly enough.
Yeah. Those were reasons why you find moral non-naturalism to be implausible, and you think that they would reject the argument that we have no other ways of forming reliable beliefs. But do you think that that if moral non-naturalism is true, that phenomenal introspection remains an especially reliable way of forming moral beliefs?
Do I think that if non-naturalism is true? Yeah. So suppose non-naturalism is true, what happens then? Well, then we have one way of knowing some goods, phenomenal introspection, and some bads, phenomenal introspection, tell you pleasure is good, displeasure is bad. And then we're going to have a second way as well of knowing a lot of moral stuff. So you could have that. You could have, okay, and then you'd have a rich and complicated, set of moral facts. One set of facts that are known in this naturalistic way, one set of facts that are known in this non-naturalistic way, and some kind of way of figuring out how they add up is going to have to be in the theory, but you could build that. Yeah. So that's a way you can go, but then I need to hear the story about how you're beating the evolutionary debunking arguments and the argument from disagree.
Yep. Okay. One other question is, what do you say about people like Schwitzgebel who say that our introspective processes are not particularly reliable?
Yeah, the problem with this Schwitzgebel paper is a lot of the times when he criticizes phenomenal introspection, it's either under conditions that are so hard that they beat everything else, or it's something other than phenomenal introspection affecting you. In a lot of the cases, he has something like that is going on. So if you're misled about what kind of surroundings you're in, and you sort of come in with expectations that things are going to be one way, and then you have an experience and you say the experience is the way you expected it to be, rather than, well, the way the experience actually was. The process that got you your belief is not phenomenal introspection. It's whatever built your expectations. One of the things that I think that paper taught me, this is, I think, the most valuable thing about the paper, because I don't think any of the arguments against introspection are really good, and even worth, any especially serious consideration. The thing that's really important in the paper is at the end when he tells you about food. Because one thing I realized from this paper was that a lot of what I was thinking food tasted like came from preconceived ideas about what the food would be like. And often, especially when I eat food that I've eaten before, really, if you ask me, is this crunchy? I'm not going to remember that specific instance of like crunch in my mouth and the sort of sensations it involved. I'm just going to go on generally, this is a crunchy food. And that's how I've been doing it. And the thing I realized after reading Schwitzgebel was that I really need to sort of savor the sensory experience of eating food more directly, because way too often I'm not enjoying my food enough because I'm just going on sort of, you know, it sort of showed me that I wasn't doing it right. So now I think I thank Schwitzgebel for that, but I don't think that the any of the arguments against introspection are good. Also on the scientific side, there's all kinds of papers by I especially like sort of more specifically. There's a paper by I think Sean Hermanson. I hope I'm getting his name right. Let me just make sure I've got this right. Yeah. And another more general paper by Uljana or Uliana Feast that are on introspection that I think are very good, and that are just basically showing both that Hermanson is saying that a lot of the scientific evidence that Schwitzgebel uses against introspection, is from echolocation and things like that. There's better ways to account for it. Feast is sort of saying general things about the usefulness of phenomenal introspection. I don't necessarily have to have phenomenal introspection being infallible. It can just be highly reliable and the thing works. But I don't know. It's hard for me to find cases where, apart from just like, okay, I can't tell if this has 1,000 or 1,002 sides, where that kind of complexity, messes up visual perception, messes up every system. You can't really do fine discrimination on a lot of things. Apart from cases like that, I just don't see much evidence for counterexamples for the general reliability of phenomenal introspection.
Okay. So one more question. So you said that if it turned out that that we, going back to the hypothetical, this the 8-ball informed us that pain was good and pleasure was bad. That you would at that point probably stop caring about morality. But so what would you say to someone who just thinks that the implications of hedonistic act utilitarianism are just so depraved that that so we should allow the world to be eaten by a utility monster. We should torture small children in an infinite number of possible worlds, etc. That they say, okay, if that's what ethics is, I don't care about ethics.
That's, a reasonable kind of answer. I guess what we should go to then is the universality argument, where I sort of get into really what's at stake in ethics as far as, what does it mean for anything else? Because what I want to say there is it's the questions we're answering here are about how we should feel. And I could explain why it is that we should feel one way about the pleasure of others rather than another.
Yeah, okay, so then this seems like a good time. Do you want to lay out the universality argument?
Yeah, okay. So this argument is probably the most novel thing I have for you. It's it starts out by explaining what good means, and this is supposed to be a meaning that people of all normative ethical theories could accept. So what I think it means to call something good is that it should please all metaphysically possible moral perceivers. What does this mean? What's a metaphysically possible moral perceiver? Well, basically, any possible being that can have pleasant or unpleasant feelings about things and take them to be, in some sense, objective representations of how the things are, or representations of how the things objectively are. This may be easier to describe once we sort of get into what the pleasant and unpleasant emotions involved are. So feelings like hope. If you hope for something to happen and you think, this is objectively to be hoped for, this is objectively what everybody should hope for, I think you're calling it good. I think that's what it means to call something good. You say, when you say it's good, you say, this is objectively to be hoped for by all. and this is all possible beings. Certainly, I think you could try to make morality something less than that, but I think that if we're saying this is objectively to be hoped for by all, we're saying something of the size and weight of moral judgment. It's that big and that heavy. And then there's other kinds of feelings you could put in here too. If you say that kind of person should be admired by all metaphysically possible beings, well, the pleasure of admiration is the right kind of feeling to have about their character, no matter who you are, where you're from, what the physical laws of your universe are. That's the person to admire. Well, you're saying that person is virtuous and morally virtuous in this sort of, in this way that, they're universally admirable. So that's what I think we're saying in making moral judgments. Just to do one more, there is guilt about wrong action. If you think you've done an action that's so that if anybody did it, any possible person, they should feel bad about having done it, then you're seeing the action as wrong. So that's how I understand our moral judgment. That's what they're telling us, how to feel and how all beings should feel objectively. So that's what it would be, just to answer your earlier question. What moral theory is telling us, then, what hedonic utilitarianism is telling us, is this is how you should feel about all these scenarios. And when utilitarianism is counterintuitive, it's telling you should hope for these scenarios in which all this pleasure happens and sort of this displeasure happens too. And it's telling you that, or you should feel proud of doing this kind of thing, or you should feel guilty about doing that kind of thing. This is what it's saying. So that's what all this stuff amounts to. So that's the first premise. If you want to ask any questions about that, feel free to go ahead and start that now, because I'll sort of those might be helpful.
No, why don't you? I think it would make more sense to lay out the argument.
Sure. Okay, so I have this story about how all metaphysically possible beings should feel. That's what we're talking about with ethics. Now, there's a should in there. So this is not how all metaphysically possible beings do feel, because obviously they're going to differ. And that's always the first thing people ask me when I put this out there, like, but people differ. Yeah, and I'm like, yes, they do. But we're looking for which ones are right and which ones are wrong. That's what we're trying to figure out in ethics. And so we need to know how we should feel. Now, should is a normative term. And the reason this is a naturalistic argument is that I can give you a reduction of that normative term should to something from the ordinary world that is not normative, that is itself just something that we'll need for psychological purposes, for purposes of psychological explanation. And what this is perceptual accuracy. I'm reducing should to a relation of perceptual accuracy. Now, what's perceptual accuracy? Well, when you see things, there's a way that you can see them accurately or inaccurately. I see that you have a rectangular board on the wall behind you. If the board is actually a circle, I'm seeing it inaccurately. If it's rectangular, I'm seeing it accurately in that respect. I'm applying that kind of accuracy to feelings. Like, if your action is something that you should feel guilty about, I'm understanding that as guilt is the accurate feeling to have about that thing. That's what the should really amounts to there. It's kind of like, it's just the same way as the board being, circular or round. One way would be accurate and the other way would be inaccurate. Now, what is accuracy? Ultimately, it's correspondence with reality. The same thing that makes beliefs true. If I believe that I'm having a video chat right now, that's true. If I believe that I'm sitting on the beach, that's false. So it's just correspondence with reality that makes for truth and falsity of belief, and accuracy and inaccuracy of perceptions. So the issue is, when do our feelings like hope and guilt and so on correspond with reality? Now, so the second premise is basically showing that, and to defend the second premise, what I spend a lot of time doing in the paper is attacking the view that morality is instead about how to act rather than how to feel. Because if it's about how to act, I can't get accuracy in there. Accuracy doesn't apply to actions in the way that it applies to perceptions in the way that truth applies to beliefs. Actions don't represent reality. This is a point that David Hume made. There's other things in our minds that do. Perception and belief, they represent reality, but action doesn't. And that's why this way of understanding should is not something that's available to other moral theories, ones that don't start out from a moral feeling, or at least it sort of comes from this way of seeing moral judgments is about how to feel. Then you can do how you should feel. Then you can say how it's accurate to feel, but how it's accurate to act doesn't make sense. So the way I defend that is just looking psychologically at the kinds of things that influence moral belief that are, say, that stand in certain very strong causal relations to moral belief. And in general, just to look at belief overall, experiences causing beliefs is the most common thing that happens psychologically. It's, you have experiences right now. I have experiences of you slightly swiveling in your chair, and I update my beliefs to like, yeah, that's what Matthew is doing. Okay. Experience just comes in, it pours into my mind, and I'm constantly forming beliefs that the world is as I experience it. Now, if you look at the experience to action connection, it's nowhere near that strong. Really, or the belief to action connection, sorry, belief to action is just, that's mediated by desire. And moral belief is really nothing special here. You can have whatever moral belief you want, and it's not going to affect your actions if desire doesn't show up. And the kinds of cases I have for this, on one hand, believing that something is the right thing to do can leave you unmotivated if your desires aren't there, if you don't desire to do the right strongly enough. Similarly, beliefs about what you should desire don't just change your desires. Otherwise, people could have changed their sexual orientations much more easily than they actually found. And the attempts to sort of change people's sexual orientations from their moral judgments down has just been a colossal failure in human history. So, if the data were otherwise on those issues, then we might think, okay, beliefs could have content that's sort of fundamentally about action. But what we find is the moral beliefs just, are like any other belief in this, and beliefs in general don't have this powerful influence over actions by themselves. Desire has to come in. On the other hand, beliefs have this relation to experience that's really tight and really close. Experiences are sufficient to generate beliefs in a lot of cases. Whatever you see something as being a certain color, and you believe it's that color. You see things as moving, you believe that they're moving. It's just, that's, how stuff comes in, and that determines your belief. So if you're trying to figure out how the content of moral belief is generated, what the structure of those concepts in your moral beliefs are, well, go to experience. That's the thing that has a tight, close connection that'll explain the structure of the concepts. And the structure of the beliefs you're forming. So that's what the sort of empirical psychological argument here is for understanding morality, is in terms of how to feel, how you should feel. And then once you have how you should feel, and these are experiences that represent reality, well, what normal applies to those? It's accuracy. So that second premise, that should is accuracy, is an empirical premise. Okay, so now we have morality being about how it's accurate to feel. Now the question is, what counts as accuracy? And what we have to figure out there is, what could make an experience accurate for all metaphysically possible minds? And it has to be sort of a unified thing that gives them all the same criterion of accuracy. Now, a lot of things that constitute accuracy for various kinds of sensations aren't going to do this. So accuracy for color has a bit of a problem here, because if the aliens see everything as reversed color-wise from the way we see it, with what's bright to us being dark for them and dark for us being bright to them, then we're going to disagree about what experience is the right one to have in response to things in the world. That's just how color works. It's as Locke said, a secondary quality. It's sort of not responding to the intrinsic character of things. It's just like, hey, we are disposed to respond this way, or it looks this way to us. Shape, Locke said, is a primary quality, and that, I think, is more what I'm going for here. When I have the experience of, say, straight lines from the rectangular board behind you, what's in my visual field has a certain kind of isomorphism. It has a sameness of shape, a sameness intrinsically between, the way my visual field presents the board and the way the board really is in the world. And if the board turns out to be circular, there's that lack of sameness in the shapes. So there's that kind of sameness really would give all metaphysically possible minds the same referent. And sameness comes out as a criterion of accuracy in a large number of other perceptual and, even non-perceptual forms of representation. So one of the most fun ones is onomatopoeia. What is an accurate sort of onomatopoeia for the sound of a car? Well, it's vroom, vroom, rather than meow. Vroom, vroom sounds like a car. It resembles the sound of a car, so it's accurate about, it's an accurate car noise, whereas meow is not an accurate car noise because it doesn't sound like a car. And there's all kinds of other things. Quotations. What's an accurate quotation? Well, it's the same as the words that were actually spoken. If you put in new words, you're not doing an accurate quotation. Empathy is one of the best here. That's the one that I really want to analogize accurate moral feeling to. If you are trying to empathize with your friend and your friend is sad, you correctly represent how your friend feels if you feel sad for your friend. If you feel happy for your sad friend, you've misrepresented how your friend feels in empathy. That's if you're empathizing. If you're doing something else, it might not have that criterion of accuracy. But for empathy, yeah, feeling how the other feels is what is accuracy. That's actually the kind of accuracy that I think moral feeling has. So you should hope for pleasure for others, just like when you're empathizing with people, you should feel happy if they're happy, and if you feel sad when they're happy, you've just misrepresented how they feel and you're inaccurate. So that kind of matching is accuracy for feeling. And the kind of thing that I have to say about that's different from anything else is it'll give the same conditions of accuracy for all metaphysically possible minds. So if any possible mind is feeling pleasure about an event, what would make that accurate? Well, if there's pleasure in the event, and this kind of sameness, qualitative identity counts as accuracy, you can get all metaphysically possible minds, when they feel pleasure, to have the same criterion of accuracy. The same thing will make pleasure accurate for all metaphysically possible minds by, if it's pleasure, then any metaphysically possible mind having pleasure in response to it is having accurate pleasure. If qualitative identity is the criterion for accuracy. So this criterion of accuracy gives you sort of universality of moral feeling. All metaphysically possible moral feelings will be accurate about the same things. It's the simplest one that does that. You can build non-simple ones that do that. And this is how I understand non-naturalism. Non-naturalists are basically telling you there is this extra relation in this world, the set of moral relations. You could do this in terms of fittingness of moral feeling. The moral feelings fit the world in a very specific kind of way. This doesn't have a naturalistic explanation. There's some non-natural fittingness relations out there that say, feel this way about that. You could do that. I don't see that there's good evidence for believing in non-natural fittingness relations. But I know that there's perceptual accuracy in the world, and that there's various forms of accuracy and correct representation that are qualitative identity. So since I know that those are there, I'm going to use those as my criterion of accuracy rather than these non-natural relations that I have no reason to believe exist. So once we go with the things that we actually have some reason to believe in, like relations of accuracy as qualitative identity, then we actually get a very simple explanation for which we can empirically detect forms of representation that have it, like onomatopoeia, empathy, quotation, shape perception. Let's just use that here because we know that's there, and it'll give us a simpler explanation of moral universality of moral feeling. So that's my argument that accuracy has to be qualitative identity. So you put these together. Moral judgment is about how you should feel. How you should feel comes out to be the accurate way to feel. What makes your feelings accurate is identity, sameness of type of thing between the feeling and the at the world. And the unifying thing between all those feelings is their pleasant dimension or their unpleasant dimension, all the positively balanced moral feelings. So the ones where you see the world as good in some way, hoping for a better future, feeling proud about right action, admiring a virtuous person are pleasant. All the ones where you see the world as bad in a certain way, horror at a bad future, guilt about wrong action, hatred of a villain, unpleasant. So you have all the positively valenced moral feelings. Pleasure is the sort of unifying kernel of, feeling in them all, and all the negatively valenced ones, displeasure is the unifying kernel in them all. So what do they represent? Well, all the positively valenced ones, if you're going to get a universal set of rules for how you should feel, they have to represent pleasure in some way, and the negatively valenced ones have to represent displeasure in some way. So yeah, that's why hedonism is the universal moral truth. It tells you what all metaphysically possible minds should feel pleasure and displeasure about, and how they can be objectively right in feeling that way.
Okay, so one objection given by Parfit is sort of along the following line. So if you identify goodness with what it's accurate to feel happy about, that seems expressible in purely non-normative terms, along the lines of X is good if feeling happy about X would match how beings in general feel about X. But then whenever you say something like torture is bad, what you're saying is if your feelings were like those of the affected parties, you would feel bad about torture, or you would have an unpleasant sensation associated with torture. But given that that's expressible in purely non-normative terms, that's not something that that's not something that presumably that if a person thinks torture is good, they could fully agree with that non-claim that is purely expressible in non-normative terms, and nonetheless say that they think torture is good. So given that it can be reduced to a statement with no normative terms in it, then it's not clear how it has any force, because a person could say, okay, if my beliefs were accurate in the sense of my feelings about the feeling corresponded to the feeling, then I would feel bad about suffering. And presumably, let's take the example of retributivism. A retributivist would say, sure, I'll agree that if my feelings matched up to the feelings of the person who I think should be severely punished, then I would feel bad about it, given that they feel bad about it. But I don't care. I think that either I'm an error theorist, or I think that that's just a descriptive claim that has no reason-giving force.
Yeah, okay. So I think that works best as an objection to the idea that should comes down to identity. Because with accuracy, tell me how you. This is something that I'm not totally sure on. So yeah, do tell me how you feel about this. So suppose you tell the retributivist, your feeling of anger at this person, and you're feeling that there would be something good if suffering came to them. Suppose you say to that person, your feeling is misrepresenting reality. Reality objectively is a different way, than the way your feeling presents it. Your feeling is representing it about as well as the visual impression of a circle represents a triangle in the world. What do you think the retributivist says there? Do you think the retributivist there is kind of like, yeah, okay, my feelings are sort of like misrepresenting reality, but still I'm right?
Well, I think the retributivist would say something like, well, if all you mean by misrepresenting reality is that my feelings about the situation are different from the feelings of the person who's being tortured because they committed a horrible crime, well, then if that's all you mean by it being inaccurate, that it doesn't correspond to their feelings. Well, of course it doesn't correspond to their feelings. It shouldn't correspond to their feelings. I'm a moral person, and there's some horrible, terrible, no good, very bad person who deserves to suffer.
Yeah. Okay, good. So this is useful because what we're seeing here is that the thing I have to defend is the third premise about the identity. But I find the second premise about the accuracy to be something that potentially an opponent of the view might have a lot of trouble, pushing aside. They just want a different criterion of accuracy, as I see it, something that's not identity. So let me go over there. What I want to ask them then is, okay, so what does accuracy come out to be to you? How is this relation of accuracy structured if it's not qualitative identity. And here, what I think they're going to do, I mean, the sort of, well, the move that is the obvious for them to do, one for them to do is to pull out some kind of non-natural fittingness relation. They say, okay, look, what makes my experience accurate is not this identity thing, it's some other thing. Now, if they do it with some kind of naturalistic relation in the world, if they try to be naturalistic realists of some sort, but with a different relation, I don't see how they're going to get universality. Because a lot of the other naturalistic perceptual relations do not give you a universal ethics. For the same reason, when I was talking about the aliens who are color switched from us and how they wouldn't necessarily be wrong, well, if you just do it like we feel this way, then you don't get a universal morality, and then I don't think you even have morality of any kind, because this stuff has to be universal, or it's not morality. You're doing something relative. You're doing fashion or beauty or something aesthetic in the end, rather than morality. Morality has to be universal, I take it. So if they're giving up on universality, then I just say, okay, you're not doing morality. I have the universal thing and you don't. So that's the difference between us, and I'm happy to sort of like end that there.
Just when you say universality, all that you mean by universality, so they would say, well, so let's start with the case where they're a moral anti-realist. They'll say, look, I have desires, and all you mean by universality is that for any possible agent, if they felt about an experience the way that experience feels itself, then they wouldn't like suffering, or they would, they right. But they would say, okay, sure, that it's true that for any possible agent, if they felt about suffering the way suffering feels, they would think suffering's bad and pleasure's good. But why does that matter? Why should I care about, like, what reason giving force does the correspondence between a feeling had by by all metaphysically possible agents about a feeling and the feeling itself? Why does that have any reason giving force?
Let's not understand. So I think reason giving force is not what matters here. What matters is just accuracy, because we already agreed that accuracy was the important thing previously. If we're going to the place where at least given the previous debate with the retributivists as we were playing it out. So reason giving force is I mean, that's not how you talk about experiences. It's not that sort of experiences are set up so that that's just not the criterion on them. So if I look at the board behind you and think that's if my experience of it is circular, it's not that my experience is irrational as such. Rationality or reasonableness doesn't apply here. Accuracy and inaccuracy are what apply to experiences. So let's talk about that. In that case, what's going on here is that I can give a universal account of how the experiences are accurate, how they're accurate for everybody in a unified way that works with stuff we already have in natural reality. My opponents do not have something from natural reality that gives you universal accuracy. And that's the difference between us. Once we go to the how to feel questions, accuracy is what matters. And reason giving force is just not, something that even is relevant to this kind of debate.
Okay, but if you say something like you shouldn't torture infants for fun, it seems like what you want out of an account is one of the things you want out of an account of morality is for it to say that you shouldn't torture infants for fun, not merely that we should hope that you don't torture infants for fun. And so it seems like it has to cash out in terms of having some reason giving force somewhere along the line.
Well, okay, so here's how I understand it when you say it would. So let me do the shouldn't in terms of in a more distinctively moral term. It's wrong to torture infants for fun, and we get the distinctive moral wrong there. The way I understand that is torturing infants for fun is something for all metaphysically possible beings to feel guilt about. Is that a satisfactory account of moral wrongness?
Well, I mean, what I think. So I mean, my account is that when you say something's wrong, what you mean is we have most is that it is not what we have most reason to do. Um, uh, but that's a deeper discussion about reasons that um, versus proper feelings. But what arguments would you give for the account that says that what matters is that it's not about what it's proper? Well, I would say that it would be proper to feel guilty. Well, I don't know if I think that there's a fact of the matter about what emotions it's proper to feel. I think that there's a fact about which feelings maybe correspond to which other feelings. But, well, I mean, but I don't know that that means that you should feel a way that corresponds to other feelings.
Yeah, the should, that's a, so the move is should reduces to accuracy. First step. Second step, accuracy is identity. Second step. So that, so should to accuracy, just to do that one. So I don't jump all the way from should to identity because the intermediate point of accuracy is sort of important for, just getting us all the way. What to say there? So here, at least, there's something interesting in how we apply should to ordinary sensations. So if my sensations are just not matching the world, I'm seeing round things as square and square things are as round, I'm not seeing as I should, at least for a very ordinary kind of should that we'd apply to experience. Experience should represent reality or something's wrong with it. If it misrepresents, something's wrong there. It's not as it should be. So I think that's just such a natural way to talk about how you should perceive something. You should perceive it as it is and not some other way. So I can get should in. The thing is that if you ask me for something on the model of a reason for action, I can't give you that. And I don't think anybody can give you that, because I think that the way that they've conceived of reasons for action just comes out of a deep misconception about our psychology. That our psychology incorporates, entities, sort of contents that have a sort of reason for action type structure, that has a sort of recommending force for action, that in particular, that you could, you could believe you should do this, and that belief would do something by itself to bring about the action. You look at human psychology, that's not how it works. A desire always has to be there. And really, if you desire to do the wrong, if you desire to do as you shouldn't do, well, then the motivational force will go to the should not rather than the should. So this is why I just can't see these should concepts applied to action or should concepts coming out of belief as things that we should be working with in moral theory.
Okay. Well, so on the point about how, so I guess I'm not sure why you have to say that that reasons are intrinsically motivating in order to think that there are things that we have reasons for action. So I mean, I'll just very briefly sketch an account, sort of like I would give. I take morality to. This is not quite the definition of morality, but this is necessarily corresponds with what morality is in all possible worlds. What we would do if we were totally rational and impartial. So what you should do is what you would do if you were totally rational and impartial. And so, no, I think that there are like Parfit style arguments for why we aren't rational, for why what is making some genuine rational error if they're not impartial, about like personal identity reductionism. But we can put those aside. And so I think that morality, it doesn't necessarily have to be motivating. Maybe I think it would motivate fully rational agents, though I lean towards that view, but that view is distinct from my views about morality. And so that's saying that if you were rational and impartial, you would do this thing. But a person who's rational but is not impartial will not necessarily be compelled to do that thing. And a person who is, some combination of, given that most people are partial and irrational, it's not surprising that most people are not motivated by morality.
So what does rationality come out to be on this view? Because so I mean, you obviously some kind of like maximize expected desire satisfaction account of rationality won't work here because people could have all different kinds of desires. In that case, I guess that's the only kind of that's the notion of rationality that I can understand, sort of attaching to something that's sort of a structural feature of human psychology. What does rationality mean if not that?
Yeah, so I take that. So I think rationality involves doing what you have most reason to do, or doing what doing what you have most reason to do, and believing what you have most reason to believe. And so I think that the belief case is a clear counterexample to the claim that it's rational to do what you desire. So even if you desired to believe 1 + 1 = 3, it seems like in some sense you wouldn't be like. I think that when we reflect that, there's something. When we understand what numbers are like, we can. Well, that sounded like I was talking about consciousness. When we understand what it's like to be a number.
Oh yeah.
When we understand what numbers are like, we can know that 5 is greater than 4. Just brief side note: very often when I'm stating obvious mathematical statements, when I'm giving examples of things we know to obviously be true, I'll just say them wrong, and then they'll turn out to be false. So we all know that 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. But look, I agree with you on this. Desire satisfaction is not the story about belief, but you know what my story about belief is. It's not. I mean, the fundamental thing about belief doesn't have anything to do with what we have reason to believe. It's truth. Believing the true is the good way for it to be, and that explains what counts as a reason. Reasons are evidence that leads to truth, or has some kind of interesting relation to truth. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways to think of reasons, but all the genuine ones for belief, as I see it, truth is the fundamental thing, and don't try to understand it fundamentally in terms of normative stuff.
Well, okay. Well, so just to finish sketching at the account very briefly. So, and I think that. Yeah, and so I think that, much like when we understand what numbers are like, we know that 5 is greater than 4. Similarly, when we think about what suffering is like and we carefully reflect on it, we can know that it's bad to be in pain. And I do think that that is partially known through phenomenal introspection. I mean, if someone thinks is suffering but they think it's not bad, well, that seems like saying yellow isn't bright. It just seems like when they understand the concept, then the beliefs come to them naturally. Now,
okay.
Now,
yeah, that's
the last point, just on in terms of how. Well, so one counterexample to the claim that a belief is rational if it tends to be truth tracking. So, I mean, let's just imagine. I think that you would be rational that your beliefs about the external world are plausibly rational, but they would be so even if it turned out that you were being deceived by a Cartesian demon, such that all your beliefs about the external world were false. So I think that even if some mechanism is in fact unreliable, we can still have a reason to think that things are true.
Yeah, okay. Those sorts of things, I guess, there's kinds of epistemic rationality that I think we can do in terms of, since reasons don't apply to experience in the first place, we can have kinds of rationality that are, given these experiences, what's most likely to be true? If my experiences are accurate, what is most likely to be true? So that, I think, is at least one reasonable notion of epistemic rationality. It might match up to phenomenal conservatism, which Michael Huemer likes in a certain way. If all my seemings are good, what overall do they suggest? I think that's a fine notion of rationality, but in the end, what I'm thinking of there is really what binds it all together is a connection to truth. Now, as far as the way you've described rationality, I think is we have some kind of a ability that sort of intuits substantive rational truths, the truths of mathematics and the truths of ethics. Parfit, I think, has that kind of view. You'll see it all the way going back to people like Plato. There's a giant tradition that sees rationality that way. Now, is that psychologically plausible as an account of what human beings are doing. I mean, you could, I think the closest thing you can do is you can take a bunch of things that look psychologically diverse and variegated and say, yeah, all those are rationality and there's no deep psychological unity to all of this. What people like about the kind of picture you're giving is that it creates a big unity of normativity. I mean, you could have a unified notion of reasons or fittingness as, being a sort of a sole normative primitive that tells you to have attitudes to things. And we, with rationality, just see all these facts. I don't think that's a kind of unity that's worth disrupting scientific unity for. I think it's just a mistake to try to get normative unity by giving up on scientific unity of that kind. That's what I see doing. Okay, great. We can, if there's we can bring our Matthew's anti-realist friend in, and
wait, Lance, would you want to join the stream? If you do, I'll send you the link by email. I'm not sure if he's busy. I just saw him posting a long stream of messages in the chat objecting.
All right. Oh, okay. I haven't even seen the chat with Oh, there's more comments. Oh, wow. There's so many comments here. I haven't seen these. Okay. Actually, should I? Let me just look down. So if Just Questions is here, you can. Let me just answer the Just Questions question about when Neil says pleasure is good. I don't know what that means. I have a whole chart for you. That's on page. Let's see. What page is this? This is page. Oh gosh, I should have put page numbers on this. Well, it's the chart. It's page 6, midway through. You have definitions of a whole bunch of moral terms, and it's all done in terms of how all metaphysically possible minds should feel. So there we go. There is, so it's very clear what all this stuff means. Just Questions. You just have to look at the chart, and there's a whole bunch of definitions.
Yeah.
So what normative suppositions? This is all about how to represent reality. If you know how perception works, you can do it.
Okay. Oh, Lance said he can't join now. Well, so one other question is so why is a feeling accurate if it reflects the feelings of those involved? So it seems like it's not necessarily accurate to feel confusion about confusion. Confusion's a pretty straightforward thing.
Right.
Right. Or to feel anger about anger. I mean, maybe it's proper to feel fear about fear. The only thing fear is fear itself. But
those things don't require universality. Morality is special in a certain way where it just requires universality. And if you're not doing universality, you're doing something aesthetic. It's like fashion. It's like it's like deliciousness. It's one of those things. So that's what I see as just you can use this to explain all kinds of other things that people have done on the action side. So, people often talk about moral reasons being categorical. And that's sort of like they apply to everyone regardless of their desires. So I have that. That's a kind of universality. That's just universality on the action side. I'm going for that kind of universality on the feeling side. People also talk about morality being inescapable. You can't morality being inescapable, and hey, if it's universal, there's no way you could escape it. I might as well answer this Lance question. Why does morality require universality? Well, I just take this to be what makes it different from, say, deliciousness and beauty. People often see these things. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is a platitude we ordinarily say. But if you say morality is in the eye of the beholder, that's something that you're saying that really clashes with our understanding of the concept of morality. You can say, I guess squares have 4 sides, and that fits our idea of a square. But if you say triangles have 4 sides, no, that actually isn't part of our idea of a triangle. And to say that morality is just what everybody makes of it, well, I think the natural position there, if you're thinking something like that, the conceptually coherent position is error theory. So I'm fine with error theory. I think error theorists have a conceptually coherent view. Our is just the people who use the concept and have the term. I don't think that there's anything to concepts beyond what linguistic communities make of them. And with morality, you are going to get universality. So if you want to, I mean, there's all kinds of, I know Hagop Sarkisian has and you have Polzer and Wright here, but look at Victor Kumar's work on this. I mean, he's getting objectivity intuitions and all that out of this. So I don't really take the anti-realist sort of like, so yeah, and there's arguments you can give that send people to anti-realism, but nobody has considered the universality argument before. So I'm going to see what happens after that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, all the anti-realists will convert after watching this video.
Yeah. I mean, error theorists. This is for you folks. I've given you something that just builds up from things you know about the natural world and shows you where morality is in the natural world. If you just look at the fact that onomatopoeia is a real thing and empathy is a real thing and quotation is a real thing, and yeah, you can get it.
Yeah, I feel like your position is sort of halfway between moral non-naturalism and error theory, like in that you have really fundamental disagreements with both of them, and that you think one of them is totally wrong about the substance of what exists, and the other one is totally wrong about epistemology, and all the thing that they're using as evidence actually counts as zero evidence. So one other question. This is returning back very briefly to the first line of argument, but it's just something that I was thinking about. So suppose that we adopt the hypothesis that our moral intuitions are right roughly 95% of the time. So if we just have an intuition about a case, we'll be right 19 out of 20 times. Is there any part of that would end up that would end up conflicting with the historical record? Because that getting things wrong 5% of cases, which includes very egregious errors. And those errors will no doubt be very much shaped by culture, and people will favor those close to them, favor their tribe, and the people who are part of their moral circle. But it seems like that hypothesis can both explain how moral intuitions are a form of evidence and how explain the historical record. And well, obviously, how much we should trust intuitions very much depends. So I would defer much more to the judgment that pleasure is good than I would to judgments like about like organ harvesting, especially because I think the judgments about organ harvesting are wrong for independent reasons. But so what would you say about that claim that we don't actually need to say that they're not evidence to Lance? I sent you the link, by the way, over email. We don't need to say I emailed it to you. We don't need to say that that there are no evidence. We just need to say that they are imperfect evidence that's sometimes wrong, and that seems to explain the historical record.
Okay, there's imperfect evidence that, right. So if you get this kind of 19 out of 20 thing from intuition, yeah, I mean hey, I'd be pretty impressed by that. If we could get sort of intuition being right that often. And here it's going to be important that intuition is distinct from introspection plus the other things. So the way that I'm building up the naturalistic realist position. But yeah, if you can get that, then you have a very powerful, kind of intuition. And if it's working the same way across the different domains, good for you. Hey, Lance.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. And you?
I'm good. I didn't mean to interrupt, so just keep going.
I'm glad to see you here. I've never talked to you in person, so it's good to see you.
Yeah. So should I jump in with questions? What role should I play here? Because this is like your conversation.
No, I mean we got the error theorist, the naturalist, and the
yeah. So I wouldn't call myself an error theorist. So
sorry, I anti-realist, where you're a pluralist about semantics. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, constructivism, should I think, or?
So I call myself a quietist. So I don't have an especially conventional view on the matter. This is in fact why I shouldn't be here. I'm working on finishing up my my work on this. So I endorse this view. Are you familiar with Michael Gill from University? He was at Arizona, but I think he moved to.
Yeah. I actually, I've read his Humean Moral Pluralism book.
So he has this paper, Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics. And he has this proposal where he's like, hey, you look at 20th century metaethics, everyone's trying to offer these descriptive accounts of what people are doing when they make moral claims. And it looks pretty intractable. So if you start with from the realist point of view, you take these sort of prototypical statements that fit a realist analysis. And then the realist has to try to sort of explain away the sort of like expressivist elements of it and the other sorts of things. But then you could start from the expressivist angle and you'd have to try to explain away the seemingly realist elements. And both of them, from a certain vantage point, of course, people that are committed to one of these sides might think we won. It's not like everybody's converted to one side or the other. You still got this ongoing controversy. And he says, here's a solution. Here's a possibility. What if when people make moral claims, they're kind of just doing both things, or maybe they're just not doing anything in particular? And so he puts forward these. Yeah, he puts forward these two different hypotheses. Indeterminacy and variability. And so what I've ended up doing is sort of seizing on indeterminacy and arguing for that. So what basically my position on the matter is that I don't actually think when like non-philosophers are making claims like murder is wrong, I don't think that they have philosophical beliefs about these matters, at least especially not any substantive ones. And I don't think that the structure of ordinary moral language commits people to any particular metaethical theory. So I defend indeterminacy about that.
Let me just respond to that and say so I have a different diagnosis of what was going on. And my diagnosis, the big problem is behaviorism. Because if you couldn't talk about feelings, which you couldn't for, a lot of the mid-20th century for reasons having to do with behaviorism, the way you were trying to understand the psychological effect of moral judgment was fundamentally in terms of action. And it was sort of historically something that people were naturally disposed to do because of Immanuel Kant trying to explain everything in terms of freedom of the will. So there was a long tradition to do it. The empirical side left you unable to talk about feelings. And so that's why you got so much trouble building a satisfactory theory of moral judgment in the mid-20th century. So now behaviorism is over and we can start talking about feelings again. And once we do that, and this is exactly what I'm doing in my analysis of moral concepts, I'm just putting everything in terms of feelings, and now you can get the kind of like psychological significance and effect that you would get from the non-cognitive side. And you can also get all this sort of descriptive character that you would get from the cognitive side, because feelings represent reality just as beliefs do. So that's where the happy medium was. It was just in feelings rather than in the pure beliefs or pure non-cognitive states of things that everyone is playing with over the last 100 years.
Yeah, I do think that's a better route to go, because I don't think it doesn't sound like you're required to make claims about like the semantic structure of language. But some of the criticisms I think could have been made and weren't made is, and it took really experimental philosophy, I think, and more recent stuff to really focus on the fact that so much of this work was done, and this is a point I emphasize regardless of the realist anti-realist debate. So much of the dispute about what ordinary people are thinking, saying, and doing is based on philosophers' introspection on how they think about things. And yet philosophers are trained in particular traditions, and the ways that they're taught to think about these issues, basically, like a lot of this occurs within the sort of Anglophone world. Like if you look at the Phil Paper survey, that pretty much only went out to people in the Anglophone world. They're not looking at philosophers who are speaking a variety of different languages or come from a variety of different cultural backgrounds. And so part of my concern with the language stuff is I think that that's especially vulnerable to cross-cultural variation. But with the phenomenological stuff, I'm not sure. And there hasn't been a lot of work on that. There's very little research empirically with the meta-ethics stuff on like folk phenomenology, I guess you'd call it. There's a recent paper from just a year ago where there's one study and the results are very mixed. And that's it. That's all I know of.
Yeah, this again, I think, is sort of like the effect of behaviorism over, history. We don't have good research methodologies for linking concepts to sort of emotional experience, to feelings. And that's where I think we'd find a lot in common. If you went to different societies and said, like, okay, so here's what you call this good. How do you feel about it? I think we'd find a pretty strong correlation with people being more pleased to see the thing they call good than the thing they call bad. Being more pleased to be told that they did what they call right than what they call wrong. I think we're going to find that all over the place, a sort of universal agreement that sort of the good thing is the thing to feel pleased about rather than displeased. So that's where I think, we're going to find that. And then what I'm trying to do here is try to figure out a universal, object of that pleasure. what could it be so that, everyone would be right? And the whole system is about figuring that out. And I've got a kind of way of setting it up where pleasure is the right thing to feel pleasure about, because then your mind matches the world in this incredibly robust sense of accuracy, in the sense of accuracy that constitutes accuracy for a whole bunch of different kinds of modes of representation that have their own rather significant independence from convention. So that's the sort of way I'm trying to build this up. Alina, thank you for asking if I have a channel. No, I just show up in random places on the internet, but you can follow me on Twitter.
Yeah, so Lance, do you have any, so, I mean, given that these arguments are arguments against forms of anti-realism, and that there are arguments for accepting a naturalistic realism, do you have thoughts on, well, first on the universality argument?
So I don't know I'm not exactly sure what the universality argument is. So I jumped in about 40 minutes in and I tried to listen to old stuff, and then I was typing things, and then I was worried that if you were responding to that, I wouldn't hear it. So I had to move forward. So there's a big chunk in the middle that I'm missing.
Yeah, I recommend this to you, Lance, because I'd really be interested in seeing what you make of this, because I think I've given a sort of, very much empiricist-friendly, up from behaviorism kind of way of understanding moral concepts. And this is basically intended to take things that the error theorist believes in. I mean, onomatopoeia is a thing we can do, quotations work a certain way, and so on. To take a bunch of things like that, sort of cobble them together, and hey, now we have universal rules for how you should feel. So yeah, I think I can just make it out of all these really simple components.
Yeah, this is the kind of situation where I'd probably just have to sit down and read everything before I respond to it, because it sounds very different than the standard kinds of cases I would. So it doesn't sound like what I would get if I'm like go and read like Michael Humer or somebody else. So I can't respond to it in real time. I have to read it.
I hope you like this. This might be something that'll be the version of moral realism that is just built out of such simple stuff that I could take things you already. I see the project of naturalistic realism as taking things the error theorist can believe in and showing how they add up to objective moral truth and universal moral truth. That's what the whole project is.
So I'm happy to have a look. I'm very stubborn about a lot of this stuff. So I end up having very divergent views on a lot of more foundational issues. So I have a pretty critical sort of meta-philosophical approach. So, I am far more sympathetic to like Wittgenstein and ordinary language philosophy and stuff. So there's going to be certain sorts of things that I might take issue with. Phenomenology seems to be far less troubling of an appeal than the standard types of heavily semanticist, I guess you could call them, approaches, which is like typically the bread and butter of the kind of things that I criticize. So yeah, I'll have a look. There might be a lot of stuff that I like in there.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I will say that the sort of semantic side does play a pretty big role for me. I do think we have to get some kind of definition of moral terms out there to start with, or we don't even know what we're looking for. And I'm trying to do that in terms of, just basically universality plus pleasant and unpleasant feeling. But, so if in the end one thing you could say here, and this I think is the way to respond if you have deep semantic worries here, it'd be interesting if, you came back to me and said like, okay, Neil, you've built the system that really out of the natural world gives you universal rules for how to feel. But I don't think that's morality. Because I can't be confident in the semantics underneath this, but hey, it's kind of cool that you have a bunch of universal rules for how to feel that the natural world just imposes on us. Okay, I'm just kind of curious if anyone will do that, and I'm kind of halfway happy for that, because I think the moral terms, insofar as they have any significance, it's because they're telling us how all metaphysically possible minds should feel. And hey, if something is doing that, that's just huge.
Yeah, so this actually reminds me, a friend of mine, they're not a moral realist. They're somewhere, they're in some murky territory where they once made this point where they said, look, their kind of perspective on what they think approaches moral facts would be something like there are sort of optimal outcomes to game theoretic. There's like game theoretic solutions under certain like specified conditions, where it's like, under these conditions, this would in fact be the optimizing thing for you to do. And I found that like, okay, well, I agree with that. I just wouldn't consider that like the objective moral facts. But the thing is, I still want to know what those game theoretic optimums are in case I'm in those situations. And if it's the same thing where you end up giving me something where it can attach to what turns out to be my personal interests, here are facts about what would be conducive to my interests that could modify my behavior, that's where I would be pleased to find, if it turned out to be the case, that there would be something sort of, I guess you could say, for like practically useful. Because the standard thing I would say to more naturalist approaches to realism is that they have this triviality problem. Like if they're just going to furnish me with this set of inert descriptive facts, like, well, the good just is analytically such and such, but I happen to not care about that, that's not going to be motivating to me.
Right. Yeah, well, I can tell you what this is going to come out to be is how you should feel. In other words, what makes a feeling of guilt an accurate representation of objective reality, which I think is basically telling you, like, what should you feel guilty about? And I think I can do that.
So one thing, and I think you might have commented on this earlier, that I'm curious about is, do you think that you can, how much of a normative system do you think you could build out of this? Because if the foundation of this is some kind of hedonism, do you get like a utilitarianism out of this, or is it really sparse?
Foundationally, what I see as the foundation of this is well, I mean, from the metaethics point of view, it's just like, here is how feelings work about things. And I think that's essential to how moral concepts operate. They're telling us how we should feel about things. And what ends up happening here is when you try to figure out how you should feel about things so that you can feel the way all should feel, the answer ends up being that you should hope for more pleasure in the world, feel guilty about causing displeasure, admire those whose dispositions are towards causing more pleasure. So that's what thickens it. It's basically telling us when our feelings are accurate and when our feelings are inaccurate, when we should have them and when we should not have them. And that extra bit where you just go up from, the sort of sparse, the word good applies to pleasure. Well, now the word good has a weight. It's just telling you what you should hope for.
I think that given Lance, I take it you are familiar with Neil's other argument, which is that that the reliability argument. So phenomenal introspection informs us that pleasure is good and is a reliable process for forming beliefs. We don't have other reliable ways of forming moral beliefs, so we should just trust phenomenal introspection, which tells us that pleasure is good, and then from that we get hedonism.
Yeah. So if I introspect, like my positive experiences, I would say something like they're good to me. Like there's this sort of stance dependence to them. And so when someone says pleasure is good, it seems to be like a sort of like a bare normative claim without the meta ethical presuppositions made explicit. And I don't know if, like, when one of you, like you, Matthew, or you, Neil, say like pleasure is good, whether you mean good stands independently or like what specifically you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean it stands independently because, well, anything stance dependent could not be universal. So yeah, that's how I basically rule out constructivist views. They don't achieve universality. So it's basically is this how all possible minds should feel? I reduce should to accuracy. Would this correspond with reality for all possible minds? And then when I try to figure out how something could correspond to reality for all possible minds, it turns out that the way that something could do that is if the feeling that all possible minds had was the same as the feeling in the world. So if all possible minds feel the pleasure of hope about pleasure, they're matching it. And that kind of matching will hold across all possible worlds. So that's how I'm getting it to be hedonism rather than some other view. It's basically matching the pleasure and displeasure in our moral feelings with something in the world that could make them universally accurate.
So is that supposed to be part of the phenomenology? Because I don't have stance independence as a feature of my phenomenology. Like I don't introspect and find that there.
Yeah. Phenomenal introspection is not going to give you stance independence, and I am going to something semantic for that. I do think there's just a difference between how we talk about morality and how we talk about beauty, and how we talk about morality and how we talk about deliciousness.
If there is this semantic stuff here, that's where I'm going to start having some concerns.
And that's where you might say something like, you have given universal rules for feeling. I have no idea if that corresponds to the semantics of morality, because I don't accept standard views about the semantics of morality. And that will just be neat. So I've given you universal rules for feeling. And at that point, I'm actually sort of okay here, because I don't think morality really matters apart from the universal rules for feeling. That's where everything comes from in the first place.
Right. And then that would be a debate, but I would still be interested in that semantic.
Go.
So I'm still curious, like, why? So you do have that paper. I think it's called "Must Moral Realism Make a Semantic Claim?" And the author argues, no, it doesn't have to. And I found that to be an interesting. I don't know if you've seen that paper, but it's cool.
Okay. Who's this guy?
I don't know how to say their name. Kahane.
Oh yeah, that guy. Yeah, guy. Yeah.
Yeah, must moral realism make a semantic claim? And the answer is no. And I actually found that kind of persuasive. And so for me, it would be really appealing if I could say, hey, well, it turns out realists are wrong about the semantic claim, so realism is wrong. But I don't think that makes them wrong. So, I end up being persuaded by some of the realist arguments in a way that insulates realism from the very kinds of criticisms that an anti-realist would ordinarily make. That's why I don't endorse error theory, because I don't think if it turned out that ordinary people were making, if there were implicit presuppositions in the way they spoke that were incorrect, I don't think that would entail that there are no stance-independent facts.
Okay.
So one question that I would have is, so on the claim that you can't get stance independence from phenomenal introspection, so what would you say about cases where you, like, it seems like maybe you can, or if we think about cases where you don't desire for something. So, like, take the example of food. Let's say a person informs you that, I have memories from when I was a small child of when I was informed that a food would taste good, but it was green, so I suspected that it wouldn't, but then it turned out to taste good. So, while I was consuming it, I didn't have the desire to consume more of it, but I still recognized that it tasted good, even though I didn't have the desire to experience that. It seems like cases like that, could maybe get us.
Right. That kind of stance independence, I do think you can get from introspection. But what I took Lance to be talking about was, could you get a sort of conceptual commitment to, moral truth has to be stance independent? Could you get that from introspection? That's what I took you to be talking about, Lance. And I don't think I can get conceptual theses.
No, I have a different position on, and this is why I call myself a quietist, is that I don't actually think that the concept of stance-independent normativity is intelligible. And so what I don't say is that I think people that make the claim that there are these stance-independent normative facts are incorrect. I think what they're saying is not propositional. I don't know what they mean.
Okay. Well, stance independence of, say, scientific fact, you can accept.
That's fine. It's specifically stance-independent normative claims.
Okay.
So, one way to put it is to say, I don't believe in irreducible normativity, like at all.
Well, I don't either.
Okay, so then I don't know exactly.
I do.
Irreducible in the sense of metaphysically, like there's only the stuff of science. There's not going to be any further stuff that's the normativity, because I accept that. Now,
maybe, but you do have like Parfit and Scanlon that would say that they have non-metaphysical.
I disagree with them. Yeah, exactly. I don't.
Right, so I disagree with them, and I disagree with the ones that have a sort of metaphysically irreducible normativity as well. So
right, yeah. Okay, I disagree with all those people. So we're on the same page there.
But we're not on the same page with Matthew. So.
Oh, right, yeah, we're not with Matthew, right, yeah, because Matthew, I think, has non-naturalist leanings that, correspond to Parfit pretty well. So, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, my feelings are accurate in the sense that they correspond to Parfit.
I also want to, because I said something that might sound ridiculous now that I think about it, because I said, if it turned out that ordinary people didn't think that they were stance-independent facts, that I don't think that would entail that realism are false. That might sound, so there's a couple reasons. I just want to clarify, because I don't want like a permanent record that I said something that might sound contradictory or ridiculous. So one would be, I think what's not commonly realized is because like the error theory, everybody just talks about Mackey. People treat like there's one error theory, which is that people's claims are implicitly referencing these stance-independent facts. But there are other like error theories you can have in principle. So if people's moral claims implicitly presuppose the existence of God, but there was no God, then those claims would be false. If they implicitly presupposed libertarian free will and that doesn't exist, then the claims would be false. So what I'm saying is that the facts about whether there are stance-independent moral facts don't directly depend on what ordinary people happen to be doing when they're making moral claims, and especially at any given point in time. Because like one thing that would be very strange is like if we are going to make our metaphysical theories dependent on how people are currently speaking, what if people change how they speak? So like,
Sure.
what if like the most persuasive moral relativist in the universe convinced everybody to change their moral claims?
We don't base our metaphysics on just anything people say. I think that's good, and the God and free will examples are great there. But I do base my semantics on what people say, because that's just at some level we have to get there if we're trying to match the concepts people are using and give good accounts in conversation with other people about that are responsive to their questions. And I'm trying to respond to some of those questions in kind of accounts like I give. Can I? Oh, actually, is it okay if I just jump to a question that came up in chat real quick? This is a Vikram's question about if we're taking naturalism as a given, what happens if there's a gene defect that makes people think pleasure is bad? I just want to give my response to that so that people can see how this view works. Okay, because I'm saying that moral terms are about how all metaphysically possible minds should feel. So what about these people? Okay, let me just understand them totally. So if they're saying pleasure is bad, the way I interpret that in my theory is they're saying that pleasure is something you should have a feeling like horror about. You should feel horrified by people experiencing pleasure. Now, in other words, if you should feel that on the kind of naturalistic reduction of should I have, then you're saying that horror is the accurate thing to feel about someone's pleasure. And then I look at, okay, could that relation, is that sort of a way of having accuracy that we see in the natural world, feeling the opposite? Well, I just don't know where this opposite relation is showing up as a kind of accuracy. Really, what we have is relations of accuracy. If you want sort of a non-conventional account of accuracy in the natural world, it's stuff like, I have a square experience that matches the square, or I empathize with the other person and feel the same as they do. Sameness is where we get accuracy, not oppositeness. So if you have, and that's the problem with this person, oppositeness is just not any kind of naturalistic accuracy relation. Sameness is, and moreover, sameness is something that gives you universality. Sameness works the same for all metaphysically possible minds and unifies their response to one and the same thing. So that's just how I can derive this from top to bottom, Vikram, to get the people who have that gene being inaccurate and not feeling as they should feel because they're not matching the world in a naturalistic mode of representation. This universal.
So just going back briefly to an earlier question. So I give the example of a 95% accuracy rate of our moral intuitions, but it could be, we could make it 80%. I mean, I think how accurate we are will depend on exactly what we mean by moral intuitions. But it seems like that will both allow it to be the case that if lots of our moral intuitions point in the same direction, and that if we have moral intuitions that rest on a variety of different moral foundations, so we have like a dozen independent reasons to accept the repugnant conclusion, for example, then that can give us good reason to think that the odds that that can give us good reason to be confident in some of our moral beliefs. And if they're agreed with by all the theories, even if the theories get things right most of the time, which I think they do. I think that even Kant wasn't able to get things wrong most of the time. Maybe the natural law theorists get things wrong most of the time, but if they all converge, then that seems to give us good reason to accept it.
So to explain convergence, I think a lot of what explains convergence is the reliable process I've identified, the goodness of pleasure and phenomenal introspection. Everyone kind of has that going on, at some level in the background, is shaping their ideas about what's good and bad. And I would want to explain what convergence we see in those terms. I don't know how much of it we get from any sort of pure form of intuition or anything like that.
Okay. We'll answer there more objections that you have to the reliability argument?
I mean, it would depend on what specifically is being claimed. So I'm still not like this. Still seems like something I got to go read a paper.
Maybe we'll do another one if you want to read my thing, and we'll have some kind of a sort of a further discussion. That'll be good because this thing I wrote, it's pretty short. It's about like 5,000. It's under 5,000 words. Over once you put in the footnotes, but so it can be read pretty quickly. It has the reliability argument, the universality argument. I sort of put it up for popular consumption. Hopefully, it's going to be up on Richard Chappell's utilitarianism.net pretty soon. That's
can I ask what? So that just launched, Matthew. Are you like super excited about that? Because
that's good. I really like it.
Yeah, no, I really enjoy. I also quite enjoy utilitarianism.net.
Cool.
Though I think it's been around for like many months. Like
I haven't seen it. I just saw it's like getting like media buzz or something.
Yeah, I think what happened is Richard had been starting it up, but it was sort of like big enough at this point that he was willing to be like, "Hey, look at this." So
cool. I'll have to check it out. Yeah, so we'll just have to have a discussion. I mean, we could do it on this channel. We could do it somewhere else. Hopefully, I'll be launching my own channel, but I'm happy to show up here, wherever. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, let's see.
I don't know if I should like head out or you want me to be part of the conversation with you. I don't know how you host your stuff on your channel.
I might have to go pretty soon, but let's if you have any last things, if folks want to ask anything, I'm happy to do it for a couple more minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So one question is so while hope and delight and so on are pleasurable, why is the relevant correspondence the feature of hope and delight and horror, etc., that are pleasurable or unpleasurable? So I raised this objection before, but just for those in the audience who did not listen to our private conversation,
sure.
So we're not being the NSA.
So the idea, Matthew. So the question here is, why am I just applying this kind of accuracy to the pleasure and displeasure specifically, rather than the richer moral feelings of, say, hope and guilt and so on? Because then what I would get is something like, you should feel guilty about doing something that causes guilt, which is not quite what I want. I want it to be, you should feel guilty about doing something that causes displeasure. The reason I do it this way, I'm sort of seeing the pleasure and displeasure in our moral feelings as what's sort of essential to the moral character, to the application of moral concepts, really, because. So to take two moral feelings that you can have towards bad things, you can feel sad about something bad happening, or you can feel horrified about something bad happening. Those, I think, are accurate responses in their own way to a certain kind of bad thing happening. Maybe you feel horror if you suddenly realized it, and you feel sad if you've known it's been there for a long time whenever you think about it. So what they have in common is this displeasure in them. And that's why I think, as you put it nicely once, Matthew, my view is basically telling you to feel good about feeling good and feel bad about, feeling bad, or feel good about good feelings in the world and feel bad about bad feelings in the world. That's kind of the pleasure match. And that's what I can find as unifying across all these things. I see the project of conceptual analysis as fundamentally an explanatory project. We're trying to give some fundamental stuff that explains a large range of conceptual relations. And by explaining the structure of moral concepts specifically in terms of pleasure and displeasure, I think I can explain why a whole bunch of different feelings are in. Whereas if I enriched the feelings, I just couldn't explain how everything fits together in such an elegant and unified way.
Okay. There are no other specific questions I have. If anyone in the chat has any last minute questions, or if Lance, you have any last minute questions, feel free to ask. But if not, it seems like a good time to wrap things up.
Yeah, I'll save my questions for the next discussion.
Great.
Great.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much to both of you. See you all later. And thanks for watching, everyone.
See you later.